Towards the end of 1975, Harold Wilson and his very closest confidants were keeping a big secret. Within 5 months, he was set to resign as Prime Minister. All that he had learned in his 13 years as leader of the Labour Party, his flair for television, like no previous occupant number 10, his knack of appealing to all shades of party opinion, would come together for his final conference speech. So we take you back to 1975, to that September afternoon in Blackpool, when we know what his audience, even his cabinet, didn't know, that he would soon resign. This then was his final bow, the final bravura performance of a Prime Minister, of a performer still at the top of his game.
Mr. Chairman, I present the Parliamentary report, a report on the implementation of the manifesto we put to the people in the election of February 1974 and the one on which we fought the October election a year ago. The word manifesto is constantly heard these days, and that is right. No new party grouping over the whole spectrum of party thinking now considers itself respectable if it does not include the word manifesto in its title. We are all manifesto custodians now. Never has there been such unity in the history of the party in supporting the manifesto, or such diversity in its interpretation. As leader of the majority group in Parliament, the MPs elected by your efforts and by a groundswell of national opinion last year, I have from 4th March 1974 onwards regarded myself as a full-time, one-man manifesto group. And the Parliamentary report gives solid backing to my claim that no previous Prime Minister, no Labour Prime Minister, and certainly no Conservative, has been able to present a record of a government which has carried through so much of its manifesto by legislative and executive action in so short a time. In the 4.5 months in which the House was sitting during the short Parliament of last year, 35 bills became law, and I ask you to bear with me for a moment while I list them. We passed the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act, which repealed the 1971 Industrial Relations Act, preserved and extended existing unfair dismissals provisions and extended trade union immunities. The Health and Safety at Work Act, setting up the Health and Safety Commission. The Prices Act, which abolished the pay board, provided £500 million for food subsidies on key essential foodstuffs and strengthened the price code. We ended the sticky labels racket by prohibiting upward repricing of goods already on the shelves in the shops, and we restricted the frequency of implementation of price increases. In the National Insurance Act 1974, we fulfilled the manifesto pledge to raise pensions to £10 for a single person and £16 for a couple. The Finance Act introduced major changes to eliminate tax dodgers. The Rent Act gave security of tenure to those in furnished accommodation. We doubled the regional employment premium, which Labour had introduced in 1967 and which the Conservatives were committed to abolish. That was the short Parliament with a minority Labour government. Now the manifesto on which we went to the country a year ago. First, bills which have already been placed on the statute book in the terms of the manifesto. Child benefit, creating a new scheme of child credits. These are on the statute book. Finance number 1, introducing the capital transfer tax. Finance number 2, tackling the lump. The Housing Rents and Subsidies Act, replacing the Tory Rent Act with a new financial system for public sector housing. The Offshore Petroleum Development Scotland Act, nationalising land for oil construction sites. The Oil Taxation Act, fulfilling the manifesto proposals for taxation of oil companies' profits on the North Sea. Pensioners' payments. The Referendum Act, fulfilling our pledge to give the British people the final say on membership of EEC. The Social Security Benefits Act, maintaining the real value of pensions and creating the new non-contributory invalidity benefit, invalid care allowances to help those families with disabled members and increased family allowances, the Social Security Pensions Act, totally reforming the whole system of state superannuation and introducing the mobility allowance for the disabled. All those are on the statute book. I thought I'd mention them just in case you might have forgotten any of them. Now the bill's introduced, but not through all their parliamentary stages. The Community Land Bill, providing for the public ownership of development land. The Employment Protection Bill, providing new rights for workers at work. The Industry Bill, turning into legislative form the White Paper on which we fought the election, creating the National Enterprise Board and the system of planning agreements. The Petroleum and Submarine Pipelines Bill, creating the British National Oil Corporation and providing new powers of control over the pace of depletion and for the provisions of pipelines. The Scottish Development Agency and Welsh Development Agency legislation, establishing these two important new institutions in Scotland and Wales. The Trade Union and Labour Relations Amendment Bill, removing unacceptable Lords' amendments forced into the previous year's Act in the conditions of our then minority government. The socially redistributive budgets of November and April, the Sex Discrimination Bill asserting new rights for women and creating the Equal Opportunities Commission. All those measures are before Parliament now. I clearly can't anticipate the Queen's speech opening the second session of this Parliament, but a commitment has been given to the reintroduction of the bill already published to take the aircraft and shipbuilding industries into public ownership. Work is advanced, in some cases involving the drafting of the necessary legislation on devolution, ending the 11+, abolishing agricultural tide cottages, the development land tax, the transfer of new town housing assets to local authorities, liberalising official secrets legislation, introducing an independent element into the procedure of complaints against the police, and a race relations bill to strengthen the existing legislation protecting minorities. Work is also going on legislation to phase out pay beds, to bring the ports into public ownership, to create the Cooperative Development Agency, and weights and measures legislation to provide for unit pricing. Our outline proposals for a wealth tax have been published and are being studied by a Parliamentary Select Committee in advance of the introduction of legislation. The Government has announced its policy in respect of our pledge on industrial democracy and is setting up an inquiry to prepare the way for legislation. Well, that is a breathtaking list. Took my breath anyway. I don't know how you felt about it. It is a record of which the whole party should be proud, but it is too easily forgotten, as many of our party members may already have forgotten it. And it's a record made possible only by ministers working full-time, MPs working full-time, and above all the whips working full-time, all of them long into the night. So, relations with America, relations with the Soviet Union, relations with the Commonwealth, relations with Europe, particularly directed to strengthening democracy in Europe. That was my report to the NEC 3 weeks ago. Following that report, I felt justified in asking my executive colleagues, some with 30 years in Parliament, some with a record of political activity going back well before the war, if they could recall a time, and if they could, to name the year, when relations with the United States were better. Recall a time and name the year when relations with the Soviet Union were better. Recall a time when relations with the Commonwealth were better. Recall a time when relations with Europe were better. Still more, could anyone with a long enough memory name some halcyon period when relations with America, with the Soviet Union, with the Commonwealth, and with Europe were better than now and all at the same time? Not one such era was recalled by my very experienced colleagues, not one year nominated. I think in my 22 years on the executive, this was the first time that we could record a measurable period of absolute silence on the executive. Today, but what, of course, they still haven't learned. You can't demand massive expenditure cuts in total without committing yourself to devastating decisions on policy, including some of the main spending programs of the last Conservative government. As the Conservative Party now hurdles backwards, and it's a very difficult athletic feat, as the Conservative Party hurdles backwards over 2 centuries to Adam Smith, let me humbly remind them of the words of the now discarded Disraeli in the House of Commons some years ago. I quote, "Mere abstract and declaratory opinions in favour of reduction and retrenchment are of no use whatsoever. I have so often maintained it in this House that I am almost ashamed to repeat it. But unfortunately, it is not a principle which has yet sufficiently entered into public opinion. Expenditure depends on policy. That was Disraeli, 1862. But more, the Conservative Party are in fact committed to vast increases in public expenditure. They voted against the cuts of £600 million in defence which the government announced. This means they must obviously want to add at least £600 million to the government's expenditure. They opposed us when we cancelled Maplin. They opposed us when we stopped work on the Channel Tunnel. This was the party which last October sought a meretricious electoral bonus by their promise of 9.5% mortgages. And what's more, by Christmas. At a cost of 180 million, though the Building Society's estimate was 300 million. Let our people not forget that their means of paying for this electoral bribe was their carefully prepared plan, never fortunately put into effect, to confine local authority housing and no doubt new town housing to particular limited social groups, ghettos for the old, the sick, the disabled and the handicapped. That was their policy. To pay for increased defence expenditure for Maplin, Channel Tunnel, 9.5% mortgages, abolition of domestic rates, they would have had to reduce the social services and all other government expenditure by many thousands of millions of pounds, even to get back to where they started from. And you ask them to be specific. Ask them what they would cut. Their only reply is slash or abolish the housing subsidies and abolish the food subsidies. They're specifically committed to increasing the cost of the shopping basket by 76p a week to an average family, 46p to a pensioner. They're specifically committed to forcing up housing rents to undreamed of figures. And their answer to inflation and rising prices is to put a surcharge on the shopping basket of every family and a further surcharge on the rents of millions of households. We know the basic needs of every family are shelter and food, and the Tories' sole prescription for tackling inflation is to put up the cost of both of them. And at last they've told us why. I want you to mark this. The party which a century ago Disraeli committed to the doctrine of one nation is now proclaiming across the world their resentment at what they regard as, and I quote, the rich becoming poorer and the poor becoming richer. They talk about class politics. Who is it now who is insisting on introducing class policies and politics into England's green and pleasant land? For 18 months we've challenged them to produce an alternative economic policy, apart from putting up food and rents. In Parliament, in the country, we've had no answer. Now the message has been flashed to the people of Britain, even if it's had to be bounced off a transatlantic satellite. The political philosophy of a once great party has now been asserted. Not a claim to unite the nation, but a policy to divide it. We have been told, on impeccable and undeniable authority, that the pursuit of inequality for its own sake is now to become an end in itself. It is now to become the altar, the deity, before which they seek to prostrate themselves and the country. The hard-faced doctrine proclaimed last week is that to get taxation down, we've got to cut spending on the social wage. That phrase was used. Now £20 for the average family in Britain. What is this social wage? It's the health service, the kids' education, the people's housing, the help for those in greatest need, including the unprecedented provision we've made for the disabled and those least able to help themselves. That is their social philosophy. Their economic policy, at least, is becoming more specific. After 2 months' lucubrations, their shadow chancellor has emerged into the light and has suddenly announced, a couple of weeks ago, their fiscal policy. What did that up to? A demand for immediate changes in the tax laws to enable us to keep 3 distinguished pop groups safely within the 3-mile limit. Your government, I want to conclude by saying something about a more important party than the one I've just been referring to. Your government, with, I believe, a great swell of public support going far beyond our own party, has taken and is taking the action necessary not only to bring Britain through the world crisis, but also to create, in the words of last year's manifestos, a fairer, more democratic and more socially just society. Recent years have inevitably seen a great change in the role of this party after spending the greater part of our 75 years of history in opposition. From being the party of protest, we have now become the natural party of government in this country. Given that this present Parliament runs its full term, then of the 15 years from October 64 to October 79, we shall have been in office for nearly 11 and a half of them. And let us have the humility to recognise that this is so not because of the merits of any of us, but because of those in the party, nationally and locally, in the trade union movement and the cooperative movement, who over 75 years, in a vastly more daunting and difficult political environment, fought on with that incomparable optimism as they sang, "These things shall be." It is now our task to see that these things shall be. And as the party of government, we have to ensure that simply because we are the party of government, we are still able to fulfil the role of protest. All of us, ministers, members of parliament, constituency parties, affiliated organisations, executive, conference, the wider party, all those who have reason to protest should recognise our party as the natural voice to express that protest, for there is none other. That is why I want to stress that today the responsibility is falling on this party, every member of it, in the new historic role we now occupy and will continue to occupy for the foreseeable future. I've spoken of the role of the whole party in creating and preparing the manifesto policy which this government is carrying out. What I call for now is nothing less than the regeneration of the party in this role, the regeneration of the party on the basis of mutual tolerance and respect. We have an unprecedented national consensus, the trade union movement, party, government. At national level, we have given the lead. We need the stimulus of support and constructive criticism from the movement throughout the country. We need it more than we're getting it, actually. What is appalling is that so many of our constituency parties, particularly in safe seats, are so small in number and in some cases so unrepresentative. This was a fact which was emphasised in the Wilson Report on Party Organisation, debated at conference 20 years ago this week, together with the specific proposals we put forward for creating mass membership, and this hasn't happened. We drew attention then to parties, particularly in safe Labour seats, deliberately kept small for the purpose of concentrating power and local authority seats in small cliques, and this has not ended. But there is also the fact of some Labour seats, not always strong Labour seats, where there's great public support for the party, but where membership is kept abysmally low, mainly because those who would wish to join in the party work come once, come twice, and feeling a bit unwelcome, come no more. This party needs to protect itself against the activities of small groups of inflexible political persuasion, extreme so-called left, and in a few cases extreme so-called moderates, having in common only their arrogant dogmatism. And these groups, equally the multichromatic coalitionist fringe, or groups specifically formed to fight other marauding groups, these are not what this party is about. Infestation of this kind thrives only and can thrive only in minuscule local parties. We've all talked at one time or another about city sharks who lie in wait until they can make a takeover bid for some small company which has some rich asset or large liquid funds. But in our democracy, in our party or any other, there is no richer asset than a seat with a 5-figure majority. As socialists, we should do all in our power to control and sublimate predatory instincts in all situations. And however this happens, whether through laziness and apathy or by infiltration, often migratory infiltration, what in Yorkshire we used to call comers in, the result can too easily be groups of little exclusivities insisting on a monopoly of doctrine, thriving on noisy debate, reflecting some esoteric theory which has nothing in common with a century of the political idealism and purpose of this movement. Because what has proved possible is a takeover bid for a 20,000 majority seat based on an incursion of little more than a dozen. Nor does the answer lie in the formation of the kind of anti-party group which has been disporting itself in Blackpool this weekend. Leaking, as is their wont, their smears to an ever-ready Tory press. We've seen them at it before. A coup executed a few weeks before the February general election. A coup designed not to help the Labour Party. A coup designed to make it impossible for some of us to carry on. The success of this government, therefore, depends on two things. First, the participation of the whole movement in our programme and our manifestos, as in these recent years. Second, a determined government, a determined parliamentary Labour Party, such as we have today, with well over 300 Labour members, there with the backing of 11.5 million Labour voters. Can anyone in a broad democratic movement such as ours assert the claim that a man or woman elected by 25,000 Labour voters one week shall be given his cards the following week by a small group of 50, who in themselves represent only 1 in 500 of the Labour voters who elected him, and who only last year... and only last year recommended such a man to the electorate. We need bigger membership, a membership more fully representative of our people. Even a party with 1,000 members might embody only 1 in 25 or 1 in 30 of those who voted Labour. At local level, I make this appeal. While the record of some unions is very good, we need much more popular trade union identification, not only by the fact of affiliation, but by active work and influence. I'm expressing here, of course, a personal view as leader of the party, but it is based on a little experience of having, for my sins, chaired the organisation committee of the National Executive for longer than anyone else since the war. And there is another consideration. I have led this party so far for 12.5 years in unprecedented and difficult times for all of us. During those 12.5 years, and this is without precedent, I challenge anyone to dispute this, during those 12.5 years, not one of the near 600 Labour members of Parliament who have served in Parliament under my leadership over those years has had the party whip withdrawn. I am proud of that. Never happened before. I'm proud, too, that almost... I'm proud, too, that almost my first act on being elected leader was to insist, against a more than resistant shadow cabinet, that the whip be restored to 6 MPs, one of whom is now in the cabinet, and he replied to the economic debate yesterday with a full acclamation of confidence. I therefore have the right to ask, who are these self-appointed samurai who seek to assert a power of political life and death, which the leadership of this party and the whip's office and the organisation subcommittee of the Labour Party have not in modern times sought to assert? As a party, we are committed. I didn't ask anyone to identify themselves. It was a rhetorical question. As a party, we are committed to real industrial democracy. What we say should take place in industry, we cannot deny to our own party members. We demand more participation. If we mean what we say, then democracy means the full participation of every Labour member in the biggest decision a constituency party is asked to make, the decision who shall or shall not represent them in Parliament. Still more, when a candidate has received the stamp of electoral support extremely grave cause is required, and the fullest participation of party democracy is needed if the electorate is to be denied the right to re-elect him as an endorsed Labour candidate. Our strength lies not in enforced uniformity of party doctrine. It's based on tolerance and argument, on the ferment of political ideas and political passion, not regimentation. I don't want to lead a party of zombies. And for those who arrogantly seek to impose their doctrine, whatever it is, other than by the democratic machinery of the party institutions, including the Parliamentary Labour Party, would, I believe, if they succeeded, strike a great blow, not only against our movement, but against democracy in this country. What we are seeing is not the means of creating democracy and socialism. The strength, the support, the stimulus, the democratic criteria, the executive, the conference, the government need in a democratic party can only come from constituency organisations much more representative of those who vote, those who work for Labour victory. I call then for the regeneration of our party as a requisite to the regeneration of our country. Active, lively discussion in all our constituent organisations, national and local, political and industrial, acting not only as a stimulus and a spur to the government and the government's keenest critic, but a source of fresh ideas for the manifesto we shall all before long be involved in when this Parliament has spent its course. Let none forget that Labour's Programme 73, which provided so rich a quarry of material for our manifestos, was projected not for one Parliament only, but for the years ahead in this decade and the next. That was Labour's Programme 73. The manifestos on which we fought last year's elections put before the country a programme for one Parliament for 5 years. I understand, indeed I welcome the impatience of so many in the party who are disappointed that we have not in 15 months carried through to the last dot and comma everything we promised the British people as our programme for a whole Parliament. Not to mention those who are just disappointed that we haven't carried the whole 15-year programme through in 15 months. But it is not too early now to be thinking ahead for the next manifestos in the light of our experiences and to be testing and developing that 15-year programme for the years ahead, you and all. Conference knows... I want to just say this now. Conference knows that on the 4 occasions when I've received the commission to form a government, those who have been appointed members of that government have joined together at a service of dedication in the Crypt Chapel in the Palace of Westminster. Taking the service some years ago, 9 years ago, Lord Soper, one of our socialist peers, expressed the spirit of dedication in words which have now been embodied in successive services and which will be invoked again as each successive government is formed. I do not think any words are more appropriate to express the ideals of this movement as this week we celebrate the 75 years of socialist endeavour and achievement. And this is what he asked. Grant us a vision of our land, fair as it might be, a land of righteousness where none shall wrong his neighbour, a land of plenty where evil and poverty shall be done away, a land of brotherhood where all success shall be founded on service and honour shall be given to excellence alone, a land of peace where order shall not rest on force but on the love of all for the common life and weal. Bless our efforts to make the vision a living reality. Inspire and strengthen each one of us that we may give time, thought and sacrifice to speed the day of its coming. At this grave, testing time for our nation, I shall be content that we be all judged not only by those whose trusteeship we keep, the British nation, but by history, and judged by what we together, each of us, contribute to turning that ideal into a reality.
Wilson planned a stage-managed dramatic exit from number 10. The big secret was finally revealed on the 16th of March 1976 and received the shock headlines that no doubt gave the outgoing Prime Minister some satisfaction. One of those caught up in the whirlwind was the BBC political editor David Holmes. His interview with the Prime Minister was broadcast on Nationwide that day. And here to pick up the story, some 37 years after that bombshell announcement, is David's own memory of it.
Harold Wilson's retirement came as a total surprise to everyone, except to a very small elite in number 10, the Queen, and a few officials. The broadcasters, the press, we had to scramble to cope. I was political editor of the BBC at the time, but I was off duty down in Oxfordshire, preparing to give a lunchtime talk on politics to my brother-in-law's school in Abingdon. So a call came from a colleague in the BBC office at Westminster, and that brought me back helter-skelter. I was due, I found, to interview Wilson late that afternoon. So I scrambled, forsook lunch and the audience, and as I drove back, I tried to collect my hectic thoughts and work out some questions. They were doubtless the obvious ones, but they challenged me nonetheless. And here is the interview which resulted.
Prime Minister, what sort of Prime Minister do you think you'll be remembered as?
It's not for me to say, but I hope I'll be remembered as one who, in the face of the biggest challenges, above all economic problems the country has faced in its history, kept the party together, kept the country together, kept the country united, secured a common effort from the people and an acceptance of the sacrifices that had to be made. I wish I could have been Prime Minister in happier times and easier times.
And looking back, could you pick out any one achievement which you're most proud of?
Well, there are some away from the kind of question I've been answering. For example, to have created the Open University, which I was my own devising and which I saw through. And I think this will be remembered when many other of the arguments of today have been forgotten. But I think perhaps in the last year, turning a divided country, when an eminent journalist who's never been very friendly to me last week said the governability of Britain was in doubt when we took over 2 years ago, turning a country facing that danger into a country that was united and determined, I think that is what I would like to be remembered for.
And what about regrets? If you had some things to decide a second time, which would you change?
It would take me a long time, I think, to work all that out. Even 1 or 2 appointments passed, perhaps not those of my present ministers, 1 or 2 perhaps where I went wrong. But no, I don't think I'd like to go into that. It would be a rather long story. But I think we were right economically to concentrate on getting the country right in the 1960s. We paid a heavy price for it electorally. Now, perhaps some will say I should have gone for the votes and not for the strength of the economy.
In your statement that did you read the statement to the Cabinet?
Yes, I did.
Yes. In that statement you made an interesting remark about the fact that you're determined not to succumb to the danger of being faced with a decision you faced before, in case you mishandled it the second time round. I'm not quite sure what you meant.
No, it was a problem I was aware of when I was a civil servant very many years ago. You've looked at a problem, you've looked at a solution people have put forward, you've turned it down. There's a danger that 5 years later, when circumstances may have changed, you'll say, oh, we looked at that before, or I've been through this crisis before, and that you don't approach it with the freshness you should. I think that's a danger that can come after too many years. I hope I haven't done it, but I want to make sure that I don't, and that there'll be a fresh approach to all the problems.
But that is one of the big things which has decided you to bow out.
No, I think the big things really are, first, that I have been here a long time. It's been a long run, a happy run, almost the longest this century. I've got a wonderful team. I've got people almost of my own age group. Why should I sort of hog the thing and cling on and prevent them from having the chance of succeeding and bringing their distinctive approach? That is one of the arguments. The other argument, I think we're now at a turning point things are beginning to pick up again, very slowly, but beginning. Even unemployment is beginning to get more under control, I believe. But I would like new people to handle this. And, of course, we're at a turning point on the biggest thing of all, the attack on inflation. When we've got acceptance, against all the odds, as many people thought last year, by agreement, of what has to be done to fight inflation, the counter-inflation policy, the next stage, after the budget, will be to decide what we do for the next year. Now, I think that is the moment to go, to leave others to do the negotiations. I would hate to wreck those negotiations or even put them in risk by an interruption through the need to have an election of a new leader, and when all the party conferences, all the trade union conferences are going on and so on. And there is a little lull before the budget, before any new negotiations can take place, so I think this is the time to do it. I've had a great deal of anxiety in working out what was the right timing. I think that's right.
But that does mean that your successor is going to have one of the most difficult jobs there could be, as almost his first task, and that is obtaining agreement between differing opinions in the labour movement and the trade union movement about what that next stage of the counter-inflation policy should be.
I hope the way I handle it is going to help him, because we start from a national consensus, as well as a consensus with the trade union movement, within Parliament in the main, certainly on our side. He starts from that, and he starts with the goodwill of the country.
Jeremy Thorpe said in the House this afternoon, every Prime Minister worth his salt generates controversy. You've sometimes given the impression of enjoying controversy, the rough and tumble of politics, almost more than the achievements of government. Is that, is that right?
No, I don't like controversy. I really like a quiet life. I like to get on with the job. There's an enormous amount to do. In that same statement, I said I've got 500 different submissions and documents to read every weekend, and many late at night. And it's a bore to have to sort of take time off to deal with some controversy. If it's a genuine controversy, for example, across the floor of the House of Commons, or even more widely or internationally, or even within the party, you've got to face it. It's part of the job. I don't welcome controversy. The kind of controversy I don't particularly enjoy is when it's based on a misunderstanding, even a willful and deliberate misunderstanding, which I've occasionally had to put up with.
But you're not saying you don't enjoy the rough and tumble of the House of Commons.
Well, do you know, the real truth was that I think one of the greatest prime ministers and parliamentarians, in not necessarily for what he achieved, but in terms of his relations with the House, was Harold Macmillan. I was told he used to be almost sick before question time. I know how he felt. I've never been almost sick. But I enjoyed afterwards, but
yes.
It is pretty open-ended, all those questions. And on the whole, I'd rather have an easier time at question time.
In fact, somebody did tell me recently that you'd grown to almost dislike question time now as an experience. Is that true?
Every Prime Minister is born disliking question time. On the other hand, if he's a Democrat, he knows he's got to face it. I think if you've got a Prime Minister who said he enjoys question time and isn't sensitive to all the questions put, I think democracy is in danger. It's when a Prime Minister is not afraid of question time, then democracy is threatened.
But there is a special experience standing at that dispatch box, I imagine, which you're going to leave behind, and will there be any aspects of it you regret?
Yes, in a sort of way, of course I will, but I feel tremendously fulfilled. As I say, I've been there a long time. I've done almost all that I felt possible. I wish I could have had easier economic conditions so that we could have used the dividend of improved economic conditions for raising social standards even higher than we have.
Can I ask you, if you feel you have a political weakness, what that is?
Well, I think it's always said I'm very forgiving. The man who kicks me in the teeth one week, I won't say exactly promoting him, that takes a month. But I am forgiving because I know we're all human beings with our frailties. I'm sometimes accused of another weakness, loyalty to my colleagues. That's not a weakness. I have always backed them, even when sometimes they've put me in a spot, and I've tried to see them through. But loyalty by the Prime Minister to his colleagues is essential.
But there have been critics of yours who've said that you tended to think of the short-term tactic rather than the long-term strategy. Do you think there's any truth in that?
No, it shows how short-term their thinking is. I'm always thinking of the long-term strategy. I always have. My short-term tactics have sometimes been wrong, But I've always had the long-term strategy there. And sometimes it's a bit of a bore when you've got a long-term strategy, you can see it working out, and you have a short-term shock or wriggle or, pushed off course a bit by these things. And it is a bore when that happens. And most people, for example, those who write from day to day, can only see that. They can't see that the strategy is working out. Take, for example, the whole period up to the referendum on the common market. I knew what I was doing. I'd known for a very long time. All the headlines, all the criticisms about what I did yesterday were the crisis I was facing tomorrow. I knew what I was doing. The timing was right, the strategy was right. And the same was true. I've never been more attacked, either politically or by press and indeed interviews, for not taking a grip on things last June, on incomes policy, on counterinflation. I knew what I was doing. I had to get my timing right. I got it right. But you do have to bite on the bullet when you're criticized, and you know your strategy is right, but you've got to play your tactics to get your strategy right.
As you talk about biting on the bullet when
Yes.
you're criticized, do you think, looking back on it, that there have been times when you've been oversensitive about criticism of you?
No,
press?
I would just think that in terms of political criticism, if I could have had the same treatment as a Conservative Prime Minister, I would have been satisfied. I think in terms of other sort of things they write about, if I could have the same immunity from, poking and prying that a newspaper proprietor gets, I'd have felt that was fair. But I haven't been too sensitive, and in any case, it's all over now. I said this morning in relation to the press, I forgive them all.
And television?
Well, that hasn't been so bad. There were a lot of things that were argued about many years ago with the BBC, but I have felt it's been very fair since that time. It's any party equally can say, well, it should have been done differently, and why didn't we have a man replying to that, and so on. But the big problems with television round about the 1966 or even 70 election, all that's gone now, and I enjoy television interviews. There won't be many more now, but I've enjoyed them.
Prime Minister, you've made clear you decided to resign long before the current troubles
Yes.
within the Labour Party.
Yes.
But isn't that party really much more difficult to handle these days than any time that you've been leader?
No. Oh, it was much more difficult when I took it over. It was sharply divided, more sharply than ever before. We've always had this. And I think that now it is accepted that the leader must gather together the strands of opinion and even theology in what earlier today I called a very broad church, as we are. Keep everybody together. Don't attack anybody because he thinks differently from you. Criticize him if he plays it unfairly or gets into kind of personal abuse with other members of the party. No, I think it's much easier to lead now than it was.
Can I ask you one thing about the burden on the Prime Minister? Do you think our system puts too heavy a burden on its Prime Minister?
It varies, really. It depends on how the Prime Minister plays it. I like to know all that's going on. When I was Prime Minister in the 60s, hardly a single one of them been in the Cabinet. I had to go and do everything. It was like, football, taking the set-piece occasions, goalkeeper, taking the penalties and the corners. Now, of course, I have a very talented and experienced Cabinet. Even so, I like to know all that's going on. It's a heavy job, but a very enjoyable job. You don't get bored, and if I don't get bored, I don't get tired.
You said today...
Others may do it differently. I've known Prime Ministers not long ago who were sitting in the garden, number 10 here, reading novels in the afternoon. Well, I don't get a chance to read them even on a Saturday or Sunday.
You said today, I think, you're as fit as a flea. How fit is that?
Well, hopefully he's fit. I feel fitter now than when I was 40. I'm certainly carrying less weight. But I think I was quoting the views of my doctor who gives me regular checkups, and he's satisfied.
Prime Minister, for the last time, thank you very much.
Thank you.
What was the experience like on that day? How had he changed?
It was easier than I thought. As I drove up from the country and wondered how it was going to go, I did think I was going to be faced by an ill man, because all the business about illness and things hadn't been, well, it'd been thought of, but weren't very prominent. And I thought it was going to be really difficult, because other interviews I'd done with him had been really difficult. On a personal basis, I'm just awkward. But it wasn't like that. I mean, as you saw, he was smiling. The Wilson version of relaxed. And so it was much easier. I didn't feel his sentiment. I didn't feel tears welling in my eyes or anything of that sort. But when I look back on it, he put on a very good show.
Why did Harold Wilson resign when he did?
Oh, well, he was absolutely exhausted. And I think he couldn't have gone on very much longer had he put it off. He'd some time before shown signs of suffering from the strains of office. Those strains, of course, fall on any Prime Minister, even one as intellectually brilliant as he was. And he was brilliant. At his best in the House of Commons, he could quote extracts from Hansard's speeches, column numbers and all, at will, didn't have to think. But all that had gone by the time he retired, even a bit before. The first signs of Alzheimer's apparently had appeared. His memory was going. He had no choice.
Just watching that interview, you asked the Prime Minister how he thought he would be remembered, and he mentioned the Open University. Looking back now, how do you think Harold Wilson actually has been remembered?
Well, I think it depends very much who you are. I don't mean whether you're a reporter or where you were in politics, probably. I think he was, by the House of Commons as a whole, he was respected and by some people feared. But he stood on very firm ground at those times. He knew what he was capable of. He was capable, as I was saying, of enormous things. I don't think he was loved. But otherwise, I think I remember him for the rows which went on round him. George Brown, difficult man. All of these people, some were close to him and loyal. I mean, George was loyal in a way, but there was always a row. And I think one thing about Wilson is that he was very suspicious. And it must have been a sign of insecurity somehow. He always seemed to believe that there was a plot going on against him. Now, sometimes there were plots, but most often there weren't any. But that made no difference. And it upset everything, really, in the party. And subjects for great talk and gossip and just encouraged more dissent, I suppose. He went through very troubled times with the party and the country. But he came out standing up.
So what sort of a man was Harold Wilson?
Well, I think I always thought a puzzling one. Thrusting, brilliant. Although he appeared to the public a sort of dapper, moderately well-dressed man, pipe-smoking, straight-faced, didn't often smile. Often wearing that Ganex mackintosh of his, which was the cause of later problems. In the House, he could make virtuoso speeches, witty speeches, and in the combat of debate, he was deft and at times devastating. There was no doubt when he was there who was the central figure in the House at all. And unlike some prime ministers since, he had a marked respect for the House itself, particularly for his own members, in the chamber and out. He believed, and once again, this isn't a habit followed by other prime ministers, he thought that the only way to keep a party with you was to be with them in the House, in the smoke room, in the bars. It's not, well, no, it would be wrong to say he didn't drink much, but it wasn't that sort of man. So he was on terms with them, all of them personally, and that stood him in very good stead.
Harold Wilson has sometimes been called the first television Prime Minister. In your capacity as political editor of the BBC, to what extent do you think that was true?
Well, he was certainly more aware. I mean, his predecessors were Macmillan, who I think wished to. Macmillan really hadn't conquered the mysteries of radio, let alone television, and he was quite an innocent when it came to that. And Alec Douglas Hume, nice character as he was, I think didn't begin. Wilson had thought about that hard, and other people with him had thought hard about it. And he changed. One thing he did change, it occurs to me now, he changed the whole rhythm of reporting politics. Before Wilson, on a Friday afternoon, having visited the press bar, we used to go home about 4, and you knew fairly well that nothing was going to happen till Monday. Well, to say the least of it, that isn't so now, and it wasn't so during his time. He kept the place going. There was people around him, there were stories all the time, and the more stories, the more push the government produced on that, the more reaction there was. So the Sunday paper journalists in those days used to go to Number 10 on Saturday afternoons over a cup of tea, have a gentle briefing, and go back rather late really, and wrote their first edition stories. I don't know if it disappeared, but that sort of gentlemanly way of going about things vanished. It was all tougher. And, well, that was the tradition I was brought up in. And it was very inconvenient, all night as well. It's exhausting, frankly.
David Holmes there on the resignation of a Prime Minister who was able to step down at a time of his own choosing, a rare thing in modern politics. Now, it's 50 years since Harold Wilson became leader of the Labour Party. He wrestled with the economy, with the pound and with Europe. And so, on this anniversary, let's examine Harold Wilson's contribution to modern Britain. Welcome to Wilson's World.
Good evening.
Harold Wilson was elected Labour leader in 1963, and he spent 13 years in the post. He may not have made the impact on the country that Thatcher or Blair made, but he did win 4 general election victories, something which neither of them ever achieved. Wilson followed Sir Alec Douglas Hume into Downing Street in a black and white era, and he took Britain into colour. He posed with the Beatles, he had songs written about him, and he became part of pop culture in a way unthinkable before mass television ownership. So, what is Harold Wilson's legacy? How did he change Britain, if indeed he did? To get a grip on Wilson's world, I'm joined by 2 of his former comrades-in-arms, Shirley Williams, a former cabinet minister in Wilson's governments, one of the founders of the SDP and now a Lib Dem peer, Bernard Donoughue, head of Wilson's policy unit during the 1970s. He now sits as a Labour peer. And, with the view from the other side of the political divide, Douglas Hurd, private secretary to the Tory leader Ted Heath, former cabinet minister and now Conservative peer. Well, now, Shirley Williams, first of all, what sort of a guy was Harold Wilson? Give us a picture of his personality.
I think the absolutely crucial fact about Harold Wilson was that he really represented in himself and the way he lived and the way he chose to spend his holidays and the life of his family and his leisure time. He absolutely was a microcosm of the British middle class. He never became a member of the political elite. in the sense of being divorced from the people. I think he was, in that sense, very impressive. The other thing to say about him, which I would give him great credit for, was that he was a man virtually without discrimination. He did not discriminate on gender grounds, as was evident from the fact that he appointed several women to his cabinet on the basis of merit and not of needing to have a woman in to be statutory. And secondly, he was, I think, virtually without any racial prejudice or religious prejudice either. I think that's impressive, because I can think of him as being almost the only Prime Minister, if not the only Prime Minister, who was without any form of discrimination.
Douglas Hurd, you would at least concede that he was an extraordinary change from the kind of Prime Minister that had preceded him. Did he not, was this not a new Britain that he looked as if he ran?
I don't think he looked as if he was running anything. Of course, I look at it partly through the eyes of the man I was working for at the time, who was leader of the opposition, and his impression of Harold Wilson, which he found difficulty in expressing, he never got it, was that this was a man who actually believed in nothing, who therefore was quite careless of the truth, and didn't really bother too much about factual accuracies and the impression that he made. He wanted to be clever. He was clever. There's no doubt about that. He was an extremely clever man. But he put that across in a way which, so far as Tory is concerned, which after all quite a large part of the nation, was verging on the disreputable, because he spoke, he behaved in a view which as if there was always something else really in his mind, some stratagem.
OK, now Bernard Donoughue, first of all, a picture of the man. You knew him very well in the 70s, didn't you? What was he really like?
He was a great pleasure to work with. He was quite humorous. As Shirley stressed, he had absolutely no side. In the evening, after a heavy day's work, he'd phone his inner team up, phone me and Joe Haynes, and he'd say, come up for a drink. And we went up for a drink, and it was he who would take the beers out of the cupboard and open the beer and pour us our drinks. There was a flunky there to do that, but it never occurred to Harold to do that. And then he would want to know about the gossip. Basically, you see, he was a provincial, northern, non-conformist, middle-class individual reflecting much of our nation.
But you recognise the picture Douglas Hurd was painting of him as someone who believed in nothing.
No, I think that's quite untrue. I don't agree with that at all. I can see why Douglas says it, because Harold didn't put his beliefs right in front of the audience for the early television. He was, I think, quite deeply a nonconformist. It came out quite clearly in his attitude towards some of his fellow ministers. That he, for example, he was very opposed to people who spent their time, living it up in nightclubs and so forth. He was not somebody who was attracted to the rich. He didn't move into rich society, and I'm afraid quite a lot of prime ministers of both parties have done that. He was a very hard worker. He was a man who actually, I think, very clearly reckoned on people in terms of their ability and commitment, not in terms of whether they could, suddenly introduce him to somebody frightfully posh in Sloane Square. He was not that kind of man. And I think that Douglas is being very unfair on him.
I'm simply reflecting, and I specifically said this, the views of Ted Heath, which I think I have accurately portrayed.
I don't doubt that.
And I've since then have read a certain amount about Harold Wilson, and to some extent met him. My views have changed. I think that a lot of the points are made in his favour, like your point about being, in effect, classless, raceless, and so on, genderless. That is true, and that is because he lived at a turbulent time when all these issues were coming to the fore. That is to his credit. He preserved the Labour Party from a disastrous future.
Well, let's come on to what he achieved in a moment. But just first of all, Bernard Donoughue, before we move on, just this question. A lot of people in the public and the press saw him as well untrustworthy, devious, slightly slinky. I mean, is that utterly unfair? It sounds like you think that. Why did we get that impression?
Well, because part of him was. I mean, he loved plotting and arranging things. But the point about Harold is he was an immensely complex person. with several aspects to his character. So you could produce the evidence for what Douglas has said, and I live with the evidence of what Shirley has said. And he was rather like an onion. The more you peeled off, sort of the more you saw. But most of the case against him I could document. But it wasn't all that. There was another side to him, and he did, though he didn't present sort of high principles, because he didn't like the sort of self-righteous Hampstead left-wing Labour person, but he did have a firm belief about the kind of Britain he wanted.
Let's remind ourselves of what Harold Wilson's own aspirations were for a Labour government and the country when he faced Robin Day in an interview on the day of his election as leader in February 1963.
Finally, Mr. Wilson, as millions of people watch you now and wonder whether you would make a good Prime Minister or not, what issues do you think are uppermost in their minds?
You know, I think the first thing is that they want to see this country's standing in the world restored. They're getting a little tired of seeing Britain pushed around, as we have been pushed around and needlessly pushed around in these past years. But we shan't be able to restore our position until we can restore our economic strength. And that is why we attach so much importance to economic strength and expansion at home. But of course, we have some urgent problems. The first, perhaps, is unemployment. This should never have been allowed to develop, and we've got to take quick steps to deal with it. There are problems of pensions, problems of housing, problems of education. But perhaps most of all, we see in this country hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are not being fully used. Their energies are not being released because of the system under which we're living. We'd like to release those energies so that this country really can stand foursquare to the world.
Heady days indeed. Well, Douglas Hurd, do you think it was fair to expect, I mean, in fairness, now looking back, anybody to be able to realise those expectations in his position?
I think that he was speaking genuinely. I think that did correspond to what he thought. It's fairly old stuff, that, isn't it? I mean, in the colloquial sense of the word. I mean, we've heard that over and over again. First of all, we must get the economy right. Then we can stand square, punching above our weight, some people said.
We've heard it from Tories as well as from Labour.
Exactly. No, I'm not. This isn't a party point. But just listening to Harold Wilson, give or take the accent, taking away the accent, changing the accent, it could be a Tory speaking.
But there's a difference, and it's worth saying. And I think people forget that Harold's childhood and youth was very tough indeed. His father was unemployed for several years. He was an industrial chemist. He was sacked by ICI in the 20s. He didn't get another job until the beginning of the 30s. They had to move to take that job up. Harold had to move schools, for example. He was terribly ill on 2 occasions, lasting for as long as several months at a time. In one case, he was almost in the edge of death. In other words, what you're looking at is not a man who's just spouting a lot of language, which indeed prime ministers have spouted of both parties. Douglas is absolutely right, forever. He actually spoke from the depth of a very, very tough childhood, and that's not very common with prime ministers.
They were
good for him, but I mean, just balance against those expectations what actually happened. He was overwhelmed. Devaluation, Rhodesia, the economy, east of Suez withdrawal.
Right. But not unemployment.
No, well,
he kept unemployment down.
Point out his pluses.
All right, he moved very strongly towards a technology-based economy. I know that because I represented Stevenage, and he came up there to look at the work that was being done in all sorts of fields, aerospace and camera and stuff like that. He actually talked a language which the technologists and the techies could understand, which almost no prime minister, certainly not the blessed Alec Douglas-Home or Harold Macmillan, would ever even try to attempt to get across. He was, in many ways, I think, the point at which the old world of Britain, which had gone on all through the 50s, began to yield to a different kind of world, and I think that was very important.
Yeah, but he was going to say it wouldn't do that. He said, Bernard Donoughue, he was saying that Britain would still remain great, and he had to withdraw from east of Suez. The national plan was in tatters by the time he got to the end of his first term, and Rhodesia, he never fixed that. I mean, what did he actually achieve?
Suez is more to do with Eden than to do with Wilson, frankly.
But it was not to his discredit that he had those hopes and aspirations, but what I do think is that the experience of government in 64 to 70 was quite a searing experience for him. And working with him later, you could see the scars it left, yes, because it was later when he appeared very much not to believe in anything. And part of that was his experience of how little you could actually do as a Prime Minister in a Britain that was economically very fragile and so forth. And he had raised expectations too high, he knew that.
But not only that, Bernard, Shirley Williams, I mean, he also got things terribly wrong, didn't he? Devaluation. He kept on fighting against the prospect of devaluing the pound and had in the end to give up very humiliatingly.
Peter, you're a sophisticated commentator, and you know as well as we do that if you talk about devaluation before you act on it, what actually happens is that the markets devalue you anyway. You get none of the benefit of devaluation.
Some of his ministers were urging him to do it way before he did.
Oh, well, of course they were. But if he started talking about it, the country's credit rating would have gone right. It's happening right now all over again.
What would Ted Heath have done?
He would have held on to the pound as long as he possibly could. That was his whole instinct, was to do that.
Let's just talk about what he achieved in that long first term, that 6 years between 64 and 70.
And he did have achievements.
Well, yes. Yes, but what were they? And I mean, people like Denis Healey, for example, says that he gave us no sense of direction. Denis is very tough on him. We have this wonderful quote from Bernard Levin, who believes he didn't really achieve very much. All he did was, he was an incomparable political stuntman, Bernard Levin said. I mean, he was a tremendously agile politician. But how did he change Britain?
Look, you've got to look at the vast movement in civil liberties. And there was a huge jump from where we were in 1963 to where we were in 1977. And that jump has a lot to do with the fact that Harold Wilson supported Roy Jenkins's so-called radical revolution at the level of the Home Office, all the way from ending some of the dreadful outcomes of the courts and of prisons, through civil liberties, through removal of censorship, through the acceptance of race relations legislation. I mean, if you look at that achievement by itself, it's already moving Britain into another world, and a much more liberal world than the one it had come from.
Absolutely. He transformed this country. Much of it was Roy Jenkins, but as Prime Minister, he gave it great support. All those changes on abortion, on homosexuality
you keep
laws.
going back to these social changes, which I think anybody would accept. I mean, Douglas said you would accept.
I would.
There were social changes. But what about the position of Britain in the world? What about the economy?
Well, those he found pretty insoluble. But I have to say, those social changes are not easy to do, and many political leaders and prime ministers have done them.
Peter, I mean, hang on for a minute. These things were not imposed by Harold. They were things that were emerging all the way through the Empire and the French Empire as well as countries achieved independence. And it's their responsibility, not Harold's, and I think he actually handled it rather well.
Do you think he was obsessed by the sense of people plotting against him? Was he right to feel that?
Well, both are true. He was obsessed, almost paranoid, about politicians plotting, and especially about the press being out to get him and damage him. But it was actually true. Some politicians, not many, were plotting against him, but much of the press was plotting to damage him, whether with facts or lies. So he had a very sensitive nature that reacted to what was going on, but people out there were out to get him.
Do you think he was nearly ousted in 1968, that extraordinary occasion when Cecil King had a go at him and went to see Mountbatten and said, why don't you take over?
Yeah, absolutely ludicrous. I mean, it wasn't only... But don't forget that some of them were indeed major figures in the press, again, in the media. It was the Cecil King, who had the Daily Mirror.
Dotty people. And what they were planning was dotty. And, you know, and in the opposition, we realised that. I mean, there was no... these were absurdities. And what I think Al Wilson could be criticised for is caring about them too much.
I agree about that.
Exaggerating
I agree with that.
Other Prime Ministers have done that too. And it's a mistake. It's a great mistake for a Prime Minister to be hypnotised by what they read in the papers every morning. And Harold Wilson had that weakness. And
it wasn't every morning. It was part of his obsession. He insisted on reading the first editions when they came out the night before.
And I bet he rang you up at first thing in the morning, or late at night?
Early, 1 o'clock in the morning sometimes.
Yes, well,
editors
we've all had that in different forms. But a wise Prime Minister actually doesn't have sleepless nights because that sort of thing is going on. You have to be quite brave, and you have to carry on. You have to believe in your ability to succeed, and a good Prime Minister does that.
I agree.
I don't think Harold Wilson entirely
talking of opposition within the Labour Party, mention the words Labour and mention socialism and things like that, and you can't avoid coming up against the left-wing rebels against Harold Wilson, and one man's name won't be far from your lips. Westminster's other Big Ben, Tony Benn. Promoted by Wilson to the Cabinet in 1964, Benn went on to become a firebrand of the left. He dropped in earlier to give us this take on Wilson's world.
What he did was to keep the party together by putting ministers of different tendencies in departments so that there was a sort of balance there. And I think that was the right way of handling it. Later, the left was excluded almost completely from the government by Blair. Well, I had campaigned very strongly for the referendum. As Prime Minister, he wouldn't allow it to be discussed while he was there. But when we were in opposition, I felt free as a shadow minister to campaign for the referendum, and he was very much opposed to it. And then Jim Callaghan said, well, he said, this may be a little rubber life raft into which we shall one day wish to clamber, meaning whether you like the idea or not, it is the way of holding the party together when it is divided. And then it had been knocked out by then, and then later when the French government decided to have a referendum as to whether to admit Britain, I took it back to the Shadow Cabinet and I won the argument. So that was the way in which we brought it about, and it was quite a struggle. But I don't think Harold was very keen on it. It certainly made it possible to go through the referendum with a divided party where ministers are on opposite sides, and do so without destabilizing the party completely. So I think it was right anyway. I mean, I think it was such a big decision you couldn't possibly have taken it without the consent of the British people.
Well, now there's an issue that has fascinating echoes for what's going on right at the moment. The Prime Minister, with these doubts about Europe, who is bounced into, or whatever, into holding a referendum after renegotiating the terms of Britain's entry. Now, what sort of lessons do you think there are, Shirley Williams, in this for us today?
Well, the lesson that still makes me feel really quite bitter. I supported a referendum. I remember my colleagues, Roy Jenkins and George Thompson, resigned from the Shadow Cabinet. I mean, greatly to their credit, they didn't like referenda. I did think a referendum was appropriate for such a major constitutional decision.
What was Wilson, how did he manage the referendum? How did he manage the European issue? Quite well, or not?
Not just quite well, I thought brilliantly. I mean, he asked me to be his representative on conducting the referendum, which I did, and he said to me, I want you to do it because you're the only pro-European in his staff in number 10. But he had handled it from the beginning, as Shirley referred. He saw it as a very effective device to get him through the 74 elections. There were 2 general elections, so he didn't have the party divided over the election. They were united over the referendum, rather like the present Prime Minister is seeking. And then he waited, saw the negotiations through, and then the referendum took place. I said to him, which way are you going to vote, Harold? Because I could never be sure with him, of course. And he said, of course, I'm voting to stay in. I said, why is that? Thinking he would say because of something to do with trade and the economy. And he said, oh, it's quite clear, he said, if Britain votes to pull out of Europe, it'll put the wrong people in power in this country. And I thought that was a classic Wilsonian, original explanation.
Wilson read Cameron right now?
Different man, different circumstances in quite important ways. But one has to remember that every time we're landed with referendums now, we've had a string of them, and every time Parliament agrees to a referendum, it passes to some extent a vote of no confidence in itself, in Parliament. And we just need to be a bit careful that we're not running down the parliamentary system to such extent by these constant resort to the device of a referendum as if there was some magic in it, whereas anybody who's actually been involved, particularly overseas, in referendums knows that there's no magic and that all kinds of people vote for all kinds of reasons, whatever the ballot paper has written on it.
Back to Tony Benn for a moment. Now, Tony Benn, I thought, was being rather mild there. I don't know what you thought. But that wasn't the Tony Benn that I think we remember in that 75-6 period when he was a real pain to Harold Wilson, wasn't he? He was a left-winger par excellence.
He was a menace. But in the earlier period, he was much more moderate and constructive. It was later that he decided...
What was it like?
Well, for the Prime Minister Wilson, as for Prime Minister Callaghan, it presented them with all kinds of problems because Ben was in the government, but he then, when he chose to behave as if he wasn't in the government and dissociated himself from cabinet decisions that he had taken part in. And so this was very destructive. Both Prime Ministers would like to have been rid of him. They both said to me that. But they knew that he had a base in the party among the left-wing activists, among the trade unions, and from Wilson's point of view, that would have divided the party more than keeping him in. You know, as is said, it was better to have him in the tent than outside urinating in.
And the early Tony Benn, don't forget he began by being Minister of Technology, and undoubtedly he was brilliant at that. He was brilliantly eloquent. He could command a crowd. He was very much a man who presented himself as a man of the future, I think rightly so. And then I think as he became more and more identified with the opposition within the Labour Party to Harold Wilson and his government, of which he was still a member, you began to see him become the leader of a faction rather than the substantial leader of a whole section of the party.
Do you think that was
said
partly...
to me, Tony Benn, he said to me in 1975, he said, you know, Bernard, Tony Benn, he's immatured impressively.
Do you think that Tony Benn, do you think that it was Tony Benn's attacks on Wilson that partly accounted for his resignation? Did he see the party splitting and resign partly because of that?
No.
I think
what was it that made him resign?
I think he thought he'd... In fact, it was quite clear from his final interview that he thought he had reunited the party. In fact, it was not reunited for long. But if you listen to what his summing up of his own achievements
What made him go then?
Well, he had long planned. When I joined him in '74 from the London School of Economics, he said, you'll need 2 years' leave because I'm going to retire at Easter 1976. So all the media stuff about this was scandal and so forth was typical
You know that
nonsense.
one of the things he really feared was that he might get what was already running in his family, which was a form of a dementia. One of his most beloved aunts had died, or at least got such serious dementia in her 50s that she couldn't continue. I think that is quite true, and I think that Wilson felt that the last thing he wanted was the public to see him as a fading, dribbling, uncontrolled old man. He wasn't
no
old.
sign of that in power, was there? Even
there
at
was
the
just
end.
beginning to be the very beginning of some forgetfulness about the thing he was
I agree with what Shelley's just saying. I think he was frightened of something which might happen and which might destroy him in public, and I think that was crucial.
Absolutely. I remember the French president came for a small private lunch in number 10, and Harold said to me, will you write out a little speech or give a lunch? I said, yes, what do you want to say? And he said, well, I'd like just to say how nice it is to have him here, but this is a private lunch, so we don't have any speeches. So I said, fine. I said, but you've just said it, can't you say it? And he said, Bernard, I have this fear of suddenly going blank.
Oh, really?
No, it's absolutely true. He forgot one or two statistics in the House of Commons, just the odd one, and his memory was absolutely fantastic. He never forgot anything. And suddenly he began to see this looming threat of going the way his aunt had gone.
Let's just have a look now at Wilson reflecting on his own achievement at the end of his premiership in an interview with the BBC's political editor, David Holmes, just as he retired.
Prime Minister, what sort of Prime Minister do you think you'll be remembered as?
It's not for me to say, but I hope I'll be remembered as one who, in the face of the biggest challenges, above all economic problems the country has faced in its history, kept the party together, kept the country together, kept the country united, secured a common effort from the people and an acceptance of the sacrifices that had to be made. I wish I could have been Prime Minister in happier times and easier times.
And looking back, could you pick out any one achievement which you're most proud of?
Well, there are some away from the kind of question I've been answering. For example, to have created the Open University, which I was my own devising and which I saw through. And I think this will be remembered when many other of the arguments of today have been forgotten. But I think perhaps in the last year, turning a divided country, when an eminent journalist who's never been very friendly to me last week said, the governability of Britain was in doubt when we took over 2 years ago. Turning a country facing that danger into a country that was united and determined, I think that is what I would like to be remembered for.
I wish I'd been Prime Minister in happier times. Oh, touching that, really. And finally, just each of you give us your final verdict on Harold Wilson, his reputation, his achievements. Shirley Williams.
Well, I think he believed quite deeply in a more equal nation. I think he believed quite deeply in the chance for people to flourish wherever they came from, which, after all, he himself had done. I do think there was an element of both paranoia about the media and about his fellow members of the cabinet. But generally speaking, I think I give him credit. I think he did move Britain into a different sort of Britain, a more modern one and a fairer one.
Donoughue?
Yes, I think he did move Britain forward, and especially in the social world. He was Prime Minister at a time that was much more difficult than he ever imagined, as Britain's lack of power manifested itself, and this, in many ways, defeated him. But he did have the popular touch, and that was very valuable to watch. And he kept the Labour Party together. Unifying was what he saw himself out to achieve, and in party terms he achieved that and was a great party political leader. He was not a great statesman.
Douglas Hurd,
I think that last sentence I would entirely agree with. He had extraordinary political skills, and he was never frightened of deploying them. He was proud of his own skills, and he was very difficult to oppose successfully for that reason. But when you get beyond that, to what was actually achieved for this country, by the standards he set himself, first of all, standing in the world, secondly, mastering the difficulties of our own economy, on both those two, which are the crucial things, as he himself said at the beginning, I think he fell down.
Douglas Hurd, Shirley Williams, Bernard Donoughue, thank you all very much indeed, and that's all from Wilson's World.